we have a new neighbor, and our community welcomes Dr. Michael McCloud. And he is come to Johnson County Community College from the Metropolitan Community College, and he is the Vice President for Instruction and the Chief Academic Officer. But that's not why I think he's interesting. We have to scratch that and go to the reason that I invited him. He is, his doctorate is in medieval history. So he's a medieval historian, and to me, that is fascinating. I hate to make small your fine job, but medieval history is much more interesting.
Now, medieval history is a great sideline for me, and I actually specialize in history and literature, and so the medieval period as a whole, from the ancient world to roughly the 1700s, is a lot of the ground that I've covered over the years.
Well, so you sort of entered the Renaissance then.
Yeah, a very little bit. Most departments, I used to teach medieval lit, and most departments make the formal split between the medieval world and then the Reformation, Renaissance, and Modernists at 1700. I used to kind of sneak in to around 1750 because I like to get the Rape of the Lock in at the end of the class, and that was 1755.
So you cheated a little bit.
Yeah,
No,
so I would
that's okay.
cheat the numbers a little.
No, we won't talk about that. But he was awarded a Chancellor's Dissertation Fellow, and he's presented his academic work at the Mid-American Medieval Academy and the International Medieval Congress. So you got something to say, kiddo. I mean, you know, at least they invited you to come. So I think it's just wonderful. Middle English Romance, Knighthood, Gentry Studies, and Ancient and Medieval European History.
Yes.
I think that's just terrific. Because I like that too.
Well, it's good work if you can get it. The
Well,
students are interested. The
yeah,
people who take the
yeah.
classes are really interested, and that makes it fun.
Well, it does, because you wouldn't take that class. Otherwise, it's a little bit esoteric for,
Yes.
for a lot of people.
Yes.
Cobwebby? No, we won't say that. No. But, you know, the period that I'm interested in goes from the fall of the Roman Empire in basically the 5th century, somewhere around in there, to the Renaissance. And that's why I said you were pushing it a little bit, because the Renaissance, I always thought, began about the end of the 16th century.
Yes, yes. When you start really getting into the early 1600s, the idea of the Renaissance man, where literarians make that
See,
split.
that's you.
Yes. where we tend to make that split in the 1700s is because the works are still so influenced by medieval religious thought that when you start get things like Faust, like the Rape of the Lock, they have a lot of ties and allusions to medieval works, to classical and ancient works. And so the real break in the imagery for students doesn't happen until you're well into the Renaissance. That early part of the Renaissance man and the Renaissance university really is built on ancient constructs, and so
well,
it
you
differs.
can put them back. You can put Faust back into the medieval period, but really it was outside the church by that time.
Yes.
And
yes.
so, in the medieval period, everything of interest in culture and literacy and whatever art was all in the church. So, if you want to talk about be a medievalist, you have to be interested in the history of the church and the people that were within the church. So,
Oh yeah.
as a broad, and I know broad general statements get you in trouble, but just as a broad statement, could you describe the medieval period?
The medieval period is interesting. It involves the growth of what I like to call Western thought. I used to frame all of my early medieval classes as kind of the foundation of Western thought and the foundation of what America is based on. Because the medieval period is a time in which we really came to understand the underpinnings of the philosophies of the ancients. The concepts of science were really solidified. The idea of the college and the university were both born, which were very different constructs back then, because the college is really built on association and community. And so the community college is aptly named, whereas the university was much more nationalist in its philosophy and was based around a knowledge of all things. There is a change in the literacy level of the people. You go from a completely illiterate population with a very few clerics who read to a population that are able to read their own Bibles, that are able to read treatises and notices.
In
so
Latin.
yes, and so the ability of the law. In the middle of the medieval period, English really becomes a prominent language, and Middle English evolves from Low German and a mix of Angles and Saxon languages. And so you really start to have kind of the foundation of current Western culture occurs
And thought.
in the medieval,
Yeah.
yes. And so that to me is kind of the crux of what's interesting about the medieval world, is that to understand the world in which we live, you really want to understand that world, because everything that we are is based in those structures.
Well, and I kind of think too, even though it was kind of a chaotic and tumultuous time in many ways, civilization was getting organized.
Yes.
And I think a good place to start, Dr. McCloud, is with the Council of Nicaea, the first council in about 325.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't discuss the Council of Nicaea, and speaking of getting organized, and Emperor Constantine I, who, as you may recall, was a Roman soldier and was converted to Christianity.
Yes, and most people don't recognize that Constantine didn't end as a Christian. Constantine actually, as emperor, was a member of a number of religions.
We got to try them all.
Yes, he really did. He bounced between faiths, but he was the first to really indoctrinate the empire itself into the idea that the policies could reflect the religious belief of the emperor, and that the emperor could set kind of political doctrine alongside their religious doctrine. And so as he became Christian, he also looked at ways in which the Bible crossed other faiths. And
Well,
so
you got to organize the troops.
Yes.
Because before Constantine got the Council of Nicaea in, as I said, 325, there was a bishop here and a bishop there and a priest here and a priest there and a this and a that. And there was no coordinated effort. So Constantine, there were 3 resolutions that came out of that council, which really were most interesting. And one, the resolution of the Son of God and his relationship to God the Father.
Yes.
So we're talking now about 2 out of 3 here. And the third one, the Trinity, is coming up soon.
Yes.
And the uniform observance of the date of Easter. Why was that so important?
Well, the real important part of organizing, because Christianity in that time was still a sect. It was not a fully formed religion by religious studies tenets. It was loosely connected still to Judaism, but also had enough adherents that it needed some structure. And so the formation of determining when the resurrection would have taken place, how to observe that, really helped organize the idea that this was a standing religion, it was not going anywhere, and that it had firm observances by every member of the faith. And so it was a way to kind of organize these outlying churches that were out in these smaller provinces that weren't part of the mass.
As I said, a bishop here and a bishop there and a bishop
Yes.
somewhere else. Yeah.
And so, you know, when you read the New Testament is an attempt by a later council to pull together the story of the faith in such a way that it illustrates some of the issues of trying to organize the churches at Corinth versus the churches that existed in Rome at the main heart of the Roman Empire. And so it's a very interesting time when you think about the need to find a firm place to place Easter and a firm place to place Christmas so as to connect to this large mass of people across a huge landscape that weren't necessarily meet with one another or be in commerce, but they all have a similar belief. And that dynamic creation of a single belief helped really cement Christianity, not just as a sect of Judaism, but as a religion unto itself.
Well, and I call it getting the troops in line.
Yes.
And the reason I would submit to you is that it's very important to know when Easter comes, for everybody to know, and when Christmas comes, because it all works back to the relationship of God the Son and God the Father.
Yes.
And so he was really very smart. The contract, I call it contract, and it is a contract. It's I believe. I believe this is Easter, this is what happened. I believe this is Christmas, this is what happened. So in establishing a compendium of beliefs, if you will, then you, as you say, solidify Christianity in the New World. I also think after and Constantine must have been a really interesting guy, but I think the other interesting one that came to be in the 6th century was Justinian, and Justinian helped a little bit too. I think these pictures are so interesting because obviously we don't know what they actually looked at. They might not be as pretty as they would appear in the but what he did. Talk about the Code of Civil Law.
Well, when you start talking about having a code of civil law, one of the underpinnings that Americans are used to is the idea that there is a direct correlation between right and wrong and in our ability to create law. And Justinian took that to say, if we are to have a moral code that's defined by the beliefs of Christianity, then we have to be able to codify that into actions which are considered right and wrong, and therefore legal and illegal in his mind. And so the civil code really comes about as a real world codification of what good and evil was in the eyes of Justinian and the church fathers at that time, based on what you could actually do in your day-to-day life that would be considered sinful and wrong, then became illegal.
Well, and as you get all the laws and the Easter and the Christmas, and they write about it, more people in the church could read.
Yes.
So, they were not, I always think of Hieronymus Bosch. I love Hieronymus Bosch, with all those funny little characters, the big ears and but people who couldn't read understood. I mean, we don't know what he was talking about, but people who couldn't read, that's Hieronymus Bosch painted for those people, to
Yes.
tell them what was going to happen to them. If they didn't behave, it wasn't so pretty down there.
Well, and there were a number of, even in medieval manuscripts, we find a number of illuminations that are inscribed around the outsides of the actual script. So for folks who did not read Latin, which was the language of the church, and most of the common people who were learning to read in their own vernacular, or they were learning to read French, because the French were one of the most powerful civilizations at that time. And so if you didn't read Latin, you had a hard time, but the illuminations would allow you to recognize, okay, this is about avarice, this is about sloth, this is about gluttony, based on the kind of the fine print of what was created.
And look down below and this will happen to you.
Yes, and there was often demons and flaming pits and a number of tortures kind of at the
scary,
bottom
scary
of a lot of those manuscripts. And then the sides of the illumination kind of showed the road by which you end up in these horrible places by being gluttonous and being selfish.
Do not want to do that.
Yes.
But getting organized, all these people were each in their own way organized Christianity in the church. And I think the 6th century was kind of interesting because another person was Saint Benedict that came along in the 6th century. And he founded the first of 12, he founded 12 monasteries, but he founded the first one in 529, I believe it was. And so the Benedictines are still, some of you have a Benedictine priest in your church, and they go by the rules of Saint Benedict.
Well, and most people don't recognize that the Benedictine Code is the first of the mendicant codes that taught how a priest had to live to be right with God, and it really created a series of ideas that eventually were codified into the codes of knighthood. The Benedictine Code really underpins the Code of the Templars and a number of those other people.
Well, and the next thing that I picked what I was interested in, I told you that. So I'm the decider, so that's what we're talking about. In the 8th century now, we're talking about Charlemagne being crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. And that was important too. We're all getting organized, you see here. And there he is, he's holding the sword and the orb, which I think is really kind of interesting because That's what it's all about.
Well, it really is. It's the symbols of both the temporal power that he holds and the violence required of a good king in maintaining the borders, but also holding the orb, showing the power that God gives him over the entirety of the earth. And so you have this kind of what's called rex et sacerdos in the Latin, which is king and priest. And so there is a connection between the belief in God and your loyalty to your king. And Charlemagne, through a number of stories, really created a subculture of religious belief that was tied directly to loyalty to the throne.
Well, and the Alpha and the Omega, as they
Yes,
say, he
yes.
had it all. And it was really, I mean, you think about the power that he possessed. And of course, when they divided up when he died, and they divided up his empire, it really set the stage for the Holy Roman Empire, I would have to say.
Oh, it really did. It set the stage for a number of things, and actually it underpins what eventually became the English Empire after 1066.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the stories of how he connected his people together became foundational tales that were taken by the conquerors into England.
Yeah. Well, and you know, before we get to 1066, we have to go to the 10th century first, and we have to talk about Cluny Abbey, because Cluny Abbey is very important in the progression of getting organized.
Mm-hmm.
And it became the leader of Western monasticism. Mm-hmm. And I think the Cluniac reforms, you see, everybody got it, pushed it along a little bit.
Yeah, slowly but surely.
Yeah.
What you're seeing is a progression as we become more literary in our ability to kind of set our rules, set our feet, and design long-standing sets of rules that didn't simply last as long as one king's rule. Once you were able to start putting these things down on parchment, they began to outlive the folks who founded the ideas.
Well,
and
it
so
is.
it really...
And Cluny Abbey really became sort of a beacon because it was very, very powerful. And if you look at a picture of Cluny Abbey, you don't see anything that knocks you off your feet. I mean, it's it's sort of a plain-looking place, but certainly there was a lot of power there.
Well, it was the meaning of the place. It was not just the structure itself. It was really what it stood for.
Exactly.
as a pillar of the faith.
A symbol.
Yes, absolutely.
And symbols are always very important in the early church. Well, they're important in the church now, but they were extremely important in the early church. But I think that the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule and the Norman kings coming in, and you made reference to the Battle of Hastings in 1066.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Norman kings really brought with them a more established, in terms of Western culture, view of how things worked. Because the English at that point were roughly unified tribes that still warred with one another on a fairly regular basis. So the interior of the island of Britain was rife with kind of tribal warfare. The thing that united them was the idea of needing to repel these invaders from the mainland, from Normandy. And that really brought with it kind of the first underpinnings of what we think of as British society that eventually led to American society. The ideas that came with them, both of the church and of what it meant to be king, and how a king actually exercised their power. One of the first big pieces written in the English language at that time was Doomsday Book, which if you go and read it, I actually have a copy, and you can see...
I would expect no less.
Yeah, you can see how the king actually doled out land in order to show favor or to take favor away from individuals. And it's a huge record.
But we do have to understand that power was in the king and in the church, and they were kind of scraping at each other a lot of the time, because power, as you know, is very addictive. Mm-hmm. But one of my favorite is the First Crusade period in 1095 of Pope, because Eleanor of Aquitaine is my very favorite. And of course, Eleanor was Queen of France and Queen of England when she married Henry 2, and he was, what, 19 years younger than she, or
Yes.
something like that?
Yes.
But power again, the consolidation of power. And she was the heir to the Aquitaine, and that was a very rich part of France, actually.
Yeah, the Duchy of Aquitaine was incredibly powerful, which made her a highly sought-after commodity in marriage. And it also really solidified the power of the English throne.
She did.
Yes.
I mean, he was good, but she was better.
Well, she managed to really not only enthrone a son, but what she created in the mythos of Richard I helped solidify. I mean, the reason why you have this august kingly character that occurs in Robin Hood and all of these types of tales really is largely the work that his mother put into the creation of his myth.
Well, that's right, and she lived to a ripe old age.
Yes.
But she and Henry didn't get along so hotsy-totsy toward the end. I mean, they were kind of, at swords' point.
Yes.
However, they are buried together, and I've been there and seen their graves, and you can see their I don't know what you call them, their tombs.
Yeah, the tomb effigies are really interesting.
They are, and we can show you a picture of Henry and Eleanor. I don't know if they're fighting still or not. They may be. They may be.
They very well could be at this
are,
point, because she was a very strong personality.
And then she retreated to a convent for a little rest in her old age.
Yes.
Her sons fought together. I mean, it was really a turbulent, but she did go on that first crusade, and really I would have to submit to you that the first crusade was really the only really successful one.
I would argue that it is the only truly successful crusade. The gains that were made during the first crusade were lost slowly over time, and each crusade seemed to lose a little bit more luster, a little bit more steam from the common people, and you lost a little bit more land. One of the, actually close to here, we have one of the great crusade scholars in the country is Thomas Madden, who works over at St. Louis University. And some of his books are really interesting because he writes in a way that a non-expert can really get into the story, and you see the characters come to life.
I love Eleanor. She was one strong woman. And she, in those days, they had a lot of land that they ruled, and so they had to keep moving all the time because everybody got out of line and fights evolved. They had to keep moving, and she was on the road. And so was Henry. I mean,
court was always movable. Most people think of English monarchs as living in a single castle. That's the modern era. If you look back, even in their stories, not just the history, there were a number of ducal palaces that were held by the kings. And so where court was held really depended on where there was and wasn't strife at the current time.
That's right,
the kings
but
and
dirt
queens
had a
of
lot
England,
to do with it too.
Yes.
Dirt had a lot to do with it because they had rushes on the floor and everything went in there.
Yes.
So they had to clean out the mess, and then so they'd move to another place, clean the place out, and then they'd start moving again. I mean, it's really, I think, really interesting. And of course, there's so much interesting to talk about, and we've just got to talk about a few more. One of them is Richard the Lionhearted, who was the son that Eleanor got crowned king, but he never really, he was in the Holy Land a lot of the time, or in prison.
He was a great warrior. Richard was more in line, he would have been a fine general, much better probably than king. As king...
I don't know that he was really interested in being king.
No, he was more interested in the time he spent with his troops in the field than he ever really was in statecraft. Which is why his mother had to come out of retirement and bail him out of a number. He was actually held hostage.
Well, that's the motherly job, bail the kids out.
Yeah, he was held hostage by the Holy Roman Emperor, and she had to go and gather money from his dukes to go and bail him out and pay his ransom.
The castle at Chillon, where he was in prison, is a hotel now. I stayed there.
Ah, okay.
And it's because I really think Eleanor is just in that whole Plantagenet era. I mean, it's just wonderful. Anyway, we have to talk about the Knights Templar, because the Knights Templar, in my opinion, they were really smart guys.
Oh, yes.
And under the guise of the church, they did a lot of stuff. They got really rich. they were bankers. What
Yeah,
really
they
fascinating.
really created banking
Yeah, they
in
did.
the real way that we think of banking.
And they were warriors.
Well, they were priests and warriors.
Yeah,
So it was
yeah.
a very
I
interesting
think
intermixing.
warriors and priests rather than priests
Yes.
and warriors. Yes.
It was a very interesting intermixing of the power of the military and the power of the church. And they really used kind of their control of spaces in the Holy Land and spaces in England and France
But talk
to
about
create.
their banking. See, to me that
Well,
was big.
they were the first to really create the note, so that you could leave money in England. If you were leaving Cornwall and you were traveling to Jerusalem as a pilgrim, you could leave money. They'd give you a note that showed how much you were owed. You could take that note, and at any point along the way where they had an abbey, you could stop, take money off that note, and have the note rewritten, resealed, and so it allowed you to travel without traveling with your money. So if you
So
were
you didn't get
robbed on the
robbed, yeah,
road,
yeah.
the person who delivered the note had to actually be able to validate your seal and signature to be able to get the money. So it really was the first safe way to travel with your funding.
And the Knights Templar got a commission.
Every
It
dime
wasn't
that went in.
Nothing is free.
No. There's a percentage off the top of everything they took in.
To go to a little more gentle person, let's talk of Hildegard. She's one of my favorite people too. So you see, I'm the decider, so we bring all this in. Hildegard of Bingen is one of my favorite people too. And she was given as an oblate. And I think it would be, you see she had visions, so you can see the visions coming down from God. She was not exactly what we might call altogether, but the visions were there,
Yes.
and she was a musician.
Well, she was a figure that most people don't really know about unless they become really interested in the period. And if you look at what you had put up there, shows some things about Hildegard that were really interesting, that she was seen as a prophetess. And then at the bottom of that, the Latin inscription there reads that the glory of the Spirit of God is told in the ways of the prophets that he leaves, really. So it elevates her to a special place.
And with all of her visions and music, but her mentor was Bernard of Clairvaux. And he was kind of a hermit.
Yes.
But she was given as an oblate, and that's interesting because she was young. You give a child to the church, and she was given, so she didn't know any other life. And the anchorites, the way they had anchorites in the church, that's another thing. You get all holed up and you live in a hole for the rest of your life and pray. But they were anchored to the church, so they
Yes.
were anchorites.
Well, and some
But she was
anchorites,
not.
if you, the German have a book called the Anklingvisa, which talks about the ways of the anchoress. And it really is interesting to note that some of the women who became anchorites chose to become anchorites.
Not me, kiddo. Not me. Not me. But I think that in skipping just a little bit quickly, we can't forget that in 1299 the Ottoman Empire was founded. That's important because the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 destroyed the Ottoman Empire and created the Middle East that what we know now, and it's been nothing but trouble ever since.
Yeah, and attempts to rewrite history have never really gone very well.
No, and but I think that the end of the Ottoman Empire, or the creation of the Ottoman Empire, is really important. And then, in my opinion, 1380, I'm going to stop with the medieval period and talk about Chaucer and say, when that Aprilla with its sure sota, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which vertu in Genrid is the floor.
Oh, very good. That is the first piece that we teach anybody who wants to learn Middle English. You actually memorize that particular preamble because it involves all of the major sounds and helps them learn all of the major alphabet changes.
I did it.
Absolutely. You would be a great student.
I'd love. Are you teaching a class here?
I am not right now teaching a class. I'm doing some guest lectures in the mythology courses.
When you teach a class, I'm going to take it.
Well, I will look forward to it.
Well, I have to say, Michael McCloud, professor of medieval history and vice president of instruction and all this fine stuff, admissions and all the, he works with a lot of students here. Yeah. He's a really fine guy. And I am delighted to have you on the program, and I'm delighted for our neighbors to meet you and to talk about this chaotic period of organization of the church, of Jesus, really.
Yes,
That's
very
how it
much.
works. So thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just delighted.